The Anatomy of the Human Skull, the Cranium, Part 1. Objectives: identify the bones of the cranium on 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional models. Identify the bone markings of the cranium on 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional models. Describe the locations of the bones and bone markings of the cranium using anatomical language. The human skull has 2 major subdivisions. The first of which is the cranial subdivision. The bones of the cranium function to protect the brain. Many of the bones of the human body are named for the anatomical region for which they overlie. Viewing the skull from this perspective is what we call an anterior view, and here we can see the frontal bone in an anterior view highlighted in orange. Turning the skull to face sideways is what we call a transverse view, and here we can see the frontal bone highlighted here in orange. The posterior or rear boundary of the frontal bone is the coronal suture. The coronal suture also forms the anterior or front boundary of the parietal bones. Here we see the skull cap from a superior view. From this view, once again, we see the frontal bone highlighted in orange. Its physical boundary is what is known as the coronal suture. Here we have to remove the cap of the cranium, and we can see down inside of the skull. Looking down inside the skull, we see that the frontal bone, highlighted once again here in orange, is one of the many bones that makes up the floor of the cranium. Here in the parietal region, we have the parietal bone, which makes up the upper and rear portion of the cranium. In this superior view of the skull, we see one of the parietal bones highlighted in orange. Just above that highlighted area is the other parietal bone. The parietal bones are divided by the sagittal suture. Dividing the right and left parietal bones is what is known as the sagittal suture. Here we can see it's a squiggly line here going down between the 2 bones. We have now mentioned both the coronal and sagittal suture. A suture is a fused point in the skull. This was originally unfused and allowed for growth of the brain during late pregnancy and early infancy. Our next stop on the tour of the skull is the temporal bone. The temporal bone makes up the lateralmost aspect of the skull. We can see the temporal bone highlighted here in purple. The temporal bone joins the parietal bone at the squamous suture, highlighted here in red. This feature of the temporal bone is called the mastoid process. If you feel right behind your ear, the bumps you feel are the mastoid process. Sitting anterior to the mastoid process on the temporal bone are tiny stake-like projections called the styloid process. These are highlighted in pink. Sitting just superior to the styloid process is the external acoustic meatus, highlighted in yellow. Anterior to the external acoustic meatus is the zygomatic arch of the temporal bone. This projection forms a bridge across to the zygomatic bone, also known as the cheekbone. Rub your face from your ear to your cheek. You are now feeling the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. The most posterior and inferior portion of the cranium is the occipital bone, shown here in pink. Feel the point where your skull meets your neck. This portion of the skull is the occipital bone. Shown here as a red line is the lambdoid suture, which is the point where the parietal and occipital bones meet. This concludes part 1 of the tour of the cranium from the anterior and transverse perspective.